The message arrived just after midnight, when the house was quiet enough that I could hear the refrigerator hum and the soft ticking of the clock above the sink. I was standing barefoot on the cold kitchen floor, my phone lighting up the dark like a small, intrusive truth I hadn't invited in. Daniel's name sat at the top of the screen, calm and familiar, as if nothing in our life had already been dismantled. The message itself was short. Polite even. That was the part that made my stomach tighten. He didn't accuse me. He didn't explain. He didn't apologize. He simply wrote, "Do you really think you still have a choice?" I read it once, then again. I waited for panic to rush in, for my chest to tighten, for the fear he was counting on to arrive and do its work. Instead, there was only a strange stillness, the kind that comes right before something breaks or becomes unrecognizable. He was already out of the country. I knew that much. I also knew the accounts were empty, the joint savings we'd built over years reduced to balances I couldn't even see anymore. He believed distance made him untouchable. He believed the timing made him safe. What Daniel didn't know was that the message itself had already told me everything I needed to understand. Men who are truly certain don't ask questions, and men who believe you have no options don't feel the need to remind you of it. I locked my phone and set it face down on the counter, as if it might say something else if I gave it the chance. The house felt larger than it had the day before, the silence stretching into corners that used to be filled with conversation and routine. I didn't cry. I didn't sit down. I stood there and let the reality settle in. Not as a wave, but as a map. This was where I was now. This was the moment Daniel thought the story ended. It didn't occur to him that stories don't end just because one person decides they should. By the time the sun came up, I had confirmed what I already suspected. My access to our shared accounts was gone. Not frozen, not delayed, gone. Passwords changed, permissions revoked, the careful work of someone who hadn't acted in anger, but in preparation. This wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was a plan that had been moving quietly while I was still living inside the idea of us. I had been his wife for years. I had been the person who remembered deadlines, managed the small logistics of our life, smoothed over his silences and trusted his explanations. I wasn't reckless with money, and I wasn't ignorant of it either. That was what made this cut so clean. He hadn't stolen from me in the night. He had used what I gave him freely, the way trust always works, until there was nothing left to take. The message replayed in my head as I moved through the morning. Do you really think you still have a choice? It wasn't just a taunt. It was a diagnosis, delivered with the confidence of someone who believed the outcome had already been sealed. Daniel had always liked being certain. He liked plans, liked control, liked the feeling of being one step ahead of everyone else in the room. He assumed I would respond the way I always had, with questions, with compromise, with the quiet hope that things could still be repaired if I said the right thing at the right time. What he hadn't planned for was silence. I didn't call him. I didn't text back. I didn't reach out to his family or ask for explanations that would only be shaped to suit them. I made coffee, sat at the table, and opened my laptop. Not to plead, to look. There is a moment when you stop reacting and start observing, when fear loses its grip and something colder, sharper takes its place. I had crossed into that moment without realizing it. The more I looked, the clearer it became that this hadn't started with his departure. The money had begun to move before the suitcases were packed, before the flight was booked, before he kissed me goodbye and told me he'd call when he landed. That was when the anger arrived, quiet but focused. Not because he had left, but because he had done it believing I would be too busy grieving to notice how. I understood then what the message was really meant to do. It wasn't about choice, it was about discouragement. About convincing me that whatever path I considered next would already be blocked, already useless, already too late. He wanted me to see myself as someone reacting to events instead of someone capable of shaping them. I closed my laptop and looked around the kitchen one more time. Nothing had changed on the surface. The same mugs hung from the same hooks. The same light filtered through the same window. But underneath it all, the rules had shifted. Daniel thought he had ended the conversation. What he had actually done was remove himself from it. And as I stood there, listening to the quiet hum of the house, I realized something else, something he would not understand until much later. The message he sent wasn't a warning. It was a mistake. The first sign that something was wrong didn't arrive with alarms or missing zeros. It came as a delay so small I almost ignored it. A routine transfer between our accounts took longer than usual to post, just enough to register as inconvenient, not alarming. When I asked Daniel about it, he waved it away with the same casual confidence he used for everything else. Bank systems, end-of-month processing, nothing to worry about. I believed him because believing him had always been easier than imagining an alternative. Over the next week, the delays multiplied. A payment that should have cleared didn't. An alert that usually arrived never did. Each time I noticed, there was a reasonable explanation ready, delivered smoothly and without irritation, as if he'd rehearsed them in advance. I told myself I was being paranoid. We had never fought about money. We had never needed to. That was the quiet luxury of trust. What I didn't understand then was that those delays weren't accidents. They were tests. Small adjustments meant to see how closely I was paying attention, how quickly I would question, how much resistance he might face before moving further. And because I trusted him, because I didn't push, he learned exactly what he needed to know. By the time I realized there was a pattern, it was already too late to stop it. Access to one account disappeared first, replaced by a polite notice suggesting I contact customer service. Another account followed, then another, each change small enough to explain away on its own, devastating when viewed together. The permissions had been altered, not locked down entirely, just redirected. It was precise work, the kind that doesn't happen by accident or in a moment of anger. Daniel changed too, though I didn't see it clearly at the time. He became shorter with me, less available, then oddly attentive in bursts that felt misplaced. He would bring home flowers after days of distance, ask about my schedule in a way that felt like inventory instead of interest. Our conversations narrowed, focused on logistics, never on plans. When I tried to talk about the future, he redirected with a smile and a promise we'd discuss it later. Later never came. The morning I finally called the bank, I expected reassurance. Instead, I got a pause. The representative was polite, professional, and careful in a way that set my nerves on edge. She confirmed my identity, asked a few questions, then went quiet again, longer this time. When she spoke, her tone had changed. It wasn't alarmed, but it was guarded, as if she were choosing each word with unusual care. She explained that recent changes had been authorized, properly documented, within policy. There was nothing she could reverse on the call. I asked who had authorized them. She didn't answer directly. She told me the changes had been made by someone with the appropriate access and suggested I speak with that person. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, that there were notes on the account indicating further review. Further review of what? She didn't say. I hung up and sat there, the phone still warm in my hand, the room suddenly too quiet. That was when the truth began to settle, not as a shock, but as a slow, heavy understanding. This wasn't theft. Theft leaves evidence of force. This was something else. This was exploitation of structure, of assumptions, of the fact that I had never imagined needing to protect myself from my own husband. When I logged in again, I could see fragments of what had happened. Transfers that didn't belong to our usual patterns. Destinations I didn't recognize. Amounts broken into careful segments designed to look routine. He hadn't emptied the accounts in one dramatic move. He had drained them gradually, methodically, while I was still asking questions that no longer mattered. I didn't call Daniel after that. I didn't confront him with what I had found or demand explanations he would only twist. Instead, I started documenting everything, dates, times, screenshots, every small inconsistency I had brushed aside before. It was a strange transition, moving from spouse to observer, from participant to witness. But once it happened, it was irreversible. What unsettled me most wasn't the money itself. It was the realization that he had been living in a different timeline than I was. While I was planning dinners and weekends, he had been planning exits. While I was trusting explanations, he had been calculating thresholds. The marriage I thought we were in had already ended, replaced by something colder and far more deliberate. The confirmation came late that afternoon, when I noticed a transaction tied to an international transfer. The destination stood out immediately, not because it was exotic, but because it didn't belong in our life. We had never discussed it, never planned for it, and attached to it was a name I didn't recognize at all. That was the moment I understood that the money hadn't simply disappeared. It had followed someone. Or it had gone ahead of them, clearing a path. Either way, it meant Daniel hadn't just left me financially exposed. He had done it in service of something else, something he hadn't bothered to explain because he believed he wouldn't have to. As evening settled in, I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling without really seeing it. I wasn't angry yet. Anger requires surprise, and there was none left. What I felt instead was a sharp, unsettling clarity. The war hadn't begun when he sent that message. It had begun weeks earlier, quietly, while I was still living under the illusion that we were on the same side. And now that I could finally see it, there was no going back to the person who hadn't noticed. The name attached to the transfer stayed with me long after I closed my laptop. It wasn't familiar, and that was the point. Daniel had always been careless about small things, but this wasn't small. This was deliberate anonymity, a trail meant to disappear into routine numbers and quiet approvals. Money moves every day, names get overlooked. He was counting on that. I started where the evidence led, not where my emotions wanted to go. Flights first, travel leaves records, even when people think they've hidden their tracks well. It didn't take long to confirm that Daniel hadn't left alone. 2 tickets, same departure time, same destination. Booked close together, but not together enough to raise questions from anyone who wasn't looking for them. It wasn't a spontaneous escape or a last-minute decision. It had been arranged, coordinated, rehearsed. The realization didn't hit me like betrayal usually does. There was no rush of heartbreak, no disbelief, just a quiet tightening in my chest as pieces slid into place. This wasn't an affair that had gotten out of hand. It was something planned, something integrated into the financial decisions I was only now uncovering. The timing made that clear. The money hadn't followed the trip had followed the money. I didn't say her name out loud because I didn't know it yet. What I knew was fragmentary, a digital footprint that didn't match Daniel's world, posts from places he claimed not to care about, connections that didn't align with the version of him I had lived with for years. There were inconsistencies everywhere once I stopped looking for confirmation and started looking for truth. What struck me most was how carefully she had been kept separate from me. No overlap in social circles, no accidental sightings, no shared acquaintances. Daniel had insulated the 2 halves of his life from each other, not because he feared exposure, but because he was managing risk. Affairs fueled by impulse leave messes. Affairs built for function do not. There was a moment, months earlier, that returned to me then. A name he had mentioned once, casually, while scrolling through his phone. He had dismissed it when I asked, laughed it off as a work contact I wouldn't remember anyway. At the time, I believed him because the explanation required no effort. Looking back, I realized he hadn't been surprised by my question. He had been prepared for it. That memory didn't hurt the way I expected it to. It sharpened something instead. I began to understand that the woman he had taken with him wasn't simply a partner in betrayal. She was a logistical solution, a reason to justify movements, a presence that made international transfers look purposeful instead of suspicious. She wasn't a secret he was hiding. She was a variable he was accounting for. The more I looked, the clearer her role became. Her professional background explained the destination. Her connections explained his sudden confidence. This wasn't romance. This was alignment. Daniel had mistaken synergy for safety, believing that shared interests would protect him from scrutiny. He had believed that having someone on the other end of the transaction made the distance permanent. What he hadn't considered was how pressure changes alliances. I stopped thinking of her as a person and started thinking of her as a factor, not an enemy, not a rival, but a point of instability. People who enter arrangements like this rarely agree on everything. They agree on what they want in the moment. And moments pass. There was evidence that Daniel had already begun introducing her to parts of his world that mattered. Not publicly, not loudly, but deliberately. She had been positioned as something legitimate, something planned, something that existed beyond me. That was the part that almost made me laugh. He wasn't just leaving, he was rewriting, replacing one narrative with another, and assuming no one would challenge the transition. That assumption was his mistake. I didn't confront him. I didn't reach out to her. I didn't ask questions that would only warn them that I was paying attention. Instead, I watched. I observed how quickly he moved, how confidently he spent, how certain he was that the ground beneath him would remain stable as long as he stayed far enough away from me. There is a particular kind of arrogance that comes from believing you've outpaced the consequences of your actions. Daniel had always had that. He believed that if he moved first, he would control the ending. That belief had shaped everything he'd done, from the money he moved to the message he sent, daring me to admit defeat. By the end of the day, I understood something that changed the way I saw the weeks ahead. Daniel hadn't built his escape alone, but he also hadn't built it strong. He had relied on alignment instead of certainty, on trust borrowed from others instead of structures that could hold under pressure. And pressure was coming, whether he saw it yet or not. As I closed my laptop and turned off the lights, one thought settled in with uncomfortable clarity. This was no longer a private betrayal. He had made it public the moment he involved people who would choose sides. The question now wasn't whether he had planned carefully. It was who had agreed to stand behind him before I ever knew there was a war. The silence came before the confrontation, and in some ways it told me more than words ever could. Calls went unanswered. Messages were read but not replied to. People who used to check in regularly suddenly became busy, unreachable, wrapped up in concerns that didn't include me. Daniel didn't need to explain anything to his family. They already knew what side they were on. The first direct contact came from his sister, brief and carefully phrased, as if it had been revised before being sent. She asked how I was holding up, whether I was taking care of myself, and suggested we talk once things had settled. It was the kind of message that sounds kind until you read it closely. Nothing had settled. Decisions had been made. I just hadn't been informed. When we finally spoke, her tone was polite, almost professional. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't ask for my side. Instead, she spoke as though the situation had already been defined, as though my role now was to accept it quietly and move on with as little disruption as possible. She mentioned Daniel's stress, the pressure he was under, the importance of keeping things calm. Not once did she mention the money. Not once did she acknowledge what had been taken. That was when I realized they knew more than they were admitting. It wasn't just the words, it was the confidence behind them, the way she spoke as though outcomes were inevitable, as though the path ahead had been agreed upon by people who mattered. Phrases like, "This is for the best," and "You'll understand in time," landed with a weight I couldn't ignore. They weren't speculating. They were reassuring themselves. I saw then how carefully Daniel had prepared them. He hadn't asked for permission. He had offered them a version of events that protected what they valued most, and they had accepted it because it was convenient. I was no longer his wife in their eyes. I was a complication. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Invitations disappeared. Conversations became shorter, more guarded. When I spoke, there was a pause afterward, as if they were deciding how much of what they knew they were allowed to reveal. I wasn't being shut out with hostility. I was being managed. One comment stood out more than the rest. A relative suggested gently that I avoid making things uncomfortable by asking too many questions. It was framed as concern for everyone involved, but the message underneath was clear. There were reputations at stake, and I was not a priority. I understood then that they weren't interested in truth. They were interested in stability, even if it was built on something rotten. What hurt most wasn't their loyalty to Daniel. It was their certainty. They spoke as though the situation was already resolved, as though my objections, if I had any, would be little more than noise. That kind of confidence doesn't come from guesswork. It comes from paperwork, from assurances given and received, from systems already set in motion. As the days passed, fragments of a larger picture began to surface. References to family assets, to long-standing arrangements, to things that had existed before I ever entered their lives and, apparently, would continue without me. Daniel's decision hadn't just been about escape. It had been about preserving something larger, something his family believed was worth protecting at any cost. That realization reframed everything. This wasn't a family divided by scandal. It was a family closing ranks. I stopped expecting fairness from them after that. Expectation only leaves room for disappointment. Instead, I started listening more carefully, noting what they avoided as much as what they said. There was a pattern in their confidence, in the way they reassured each other that things were handled. That word came up more than once, casually dropped into conversations like a period at the end of a sentence. Handled. The implication was unmistakable. Something had already been signed, something formal, something binding. Daniel hadn't just planned his exit. He had secured it, with their help, or at least their knowledge. That was the moment the last of my hesitation dissolved. I wasn't dealing with a confused man acting impulsively. I was dealing with a coordinated effort to remove me from a structure that no longer needed me. And yet, for all their certainty, there was one thing they hadn't accounted for. They believed my silence meant acceptance. They believed my restraint meant weakness. They believed that because I wasn't fighting publicly, I wasn't fighting at all. They were wrong. I didn't argue with them. I didn't demand explanations or threaten exposure. I let them talk, let them reassure themselves that everything was under control. When the call ended, I sat in the quiet of my living room and felt something shift inside me, something solid and irreversible. If Daniel had been willing to involve his family, if he had allowed them to speak with such confidence about my exclusion, then the story had already moved beyond marriage. It had entered a realm governed by documents and decisions, not emotions. And if they believed those documents protected them, then that was where the truth would have to be found. That night, as I replayed their words in my head, one sentence stood out, almost accidental in its honesty. Someone mentioned that the paperwork had been taken care of before Daniel left. They said it lightly, without thinking, as if it were common knowledge. I sat there for a long time after that, staring at nothing, listening to the quiet settle around me. The family hadn't chosen a side in a conflict they didn't understand. They had chosen a future they thought was already secured. The question now wasn't whether Daniel had acted alone. It was what he had signed, who had stood beside him when he did it, and how confident they really were that no one would ever read the fine print. The envelope arrived without ceremony, mixed in with ordinary mail, its plain exterior almost convincing in its innocence. I recognized the return address immediately, not because it was alarming, but because it was familiar, the kind of place you trust by default. I opened it standing at the counter, the paper inside heavier than it needed to be, as if it already knew what it contained. At first glance, there was nothing dramatic about the document. No accusations, no threats. Just language so neutral it felt deliberately empty. Dates, signatures, clauses arranged with careful precision. The kind of paperwork that exists to make decisions look inevitable rather than chosen. I read it once without understanding what bothered me. Then I read it again, slower, letting each sentence settle where it belonged. That was when I saw it. Not a single glaring error, but an absence. My absence. Decisions framed as unilateral, authority implied where it had never existed before. The document didn't say Daniel had acted alone. It simply assumed it. It rewrote shared history into individual intent, quietly converting trust into consent. I sat down and spread the pages out in front of me, the way you might lay out evidence even when you're not sure what you're looking for yet. The language was careful, almost respectful. It didn't insult me by pretending I didn't matter. It erased me by pretending I had already agreed. A memory surfaced then, uninvited, but unmistakable. Months earlier, Daniel had asked me to sign a stack of routine forms, explaining them away with the ease of someone who knew I wouldn't question him. Administrative updates, housekeeping, things we had done before without consequence. I remembered how little attention I had paid, how natural it had felt to trust him with details that bored me. Now, reading the document in front of me, I understood what he had taken from that moment. Not just my signature, but my silence. One permission had been enough. Everything else had followed. I didn't panic. Panic belongs to people who still believe they can talk their way out of what's coming. Instead, I made an appointment. The professional I spoke to didn't raise their voice or react with visible shock. They read quietly, asked precise questions, and paused longer than they needed to before answering mine. When they finally spoke, their words were careful but not discouraging. "This is complicated," they said, "but it's not closed." That was all I needed to hear. As we went through the document together, the shape of Daniel's plan became clearer. He hadn't broken the rules. He had bent them, relying on timing, on my inaction, on the assumption that by the time I noticed, the structure would be too solid to challenge. It was clever, it was risky, and it depended entirely on one thing continuing as planned. Me staying quiet. There was another detail that caught my attention, small but telling. A witness line filled by a name I recognized immediately. Someone from Daniel's family, someone who had spoken to me days earlier with such calm assurance that everything was handled. Seeing it there transformed suspicion into certainty. This hadn't been a solo act. It had been facilitated, legitimized, smoothed over by people who believed they were protecting something bigger than me. I felt a flicker of anger then, sharp and fleeting, before it settled into something steadier. Anger burns too fast to be useful. What I needed was clarity. The timing was the next thing I focused on. Dates aligned in ways that felt intentional, decisions made just early enough to limit my options, notices sent just late enough to restrict my response. Silence, I realized, wasn't just expected. It was required. Doing nothing would allow the plan to complete itself, cleanly and without resistance. I refused to give it that satisfaction. Instead of reacting, I began cataloging every document, every date, every signature. I built a timeline not of emotions but of actions. When things were signed, when accounts were altered, when conversations shifted, patterns emerged quickly once I stopped asking why and started asking how. It was in that process that I noticed the flaw. Not obvious, not dramatic, but there nonetheless. A clause that didn't quite fit with the rest of the document. Language that suggested urgency rather than confidence. A decision made quickly where everything else had been deliberate. It was subtle enough to escape a casual reading, but once seen, it couldn't be unseen. Daniel had rushed that part. The realization didn't bring relief. It brought responsibility. A flaw is only useful if you know how to apply pressure, and pressure requires patience. I understood then that confronting him now would only warn him. He would adapt, adjust, reinforce. The advantage I had lay in his certainty that I wouldn't look closely, that I wouldn't understand what I was seeing. I closed the folder and placed it carefully back into the envelope. Nothing had changed outwardly. Daniel was still abroad. The accounts were still empty. His family was still confident. But beneath that surface, the ground had shifted. That night, I didn't sleep much, not from fear, but from focus. My mind kept returning to the same thought, steady and unyielding. Daniel believed the paperwork protected him. His family believed it ended the story. They were all counting on the same mistake. That no one would ever read past the language meant to sound final. The first move had to be invisible, or it wouldn't work. Not a confrontation, not a demand, but a quiet shift in position that Daniel wouldn't notice until it was too late to undo. I started by doing what I had never done before in our marriage. I stopped reacting and began preparing. I separated my days into tasks and my nights into planning. Every conversation I had had over the past year replayed in my head with new meaning. Remarks that once felt harmless now revealed intent. Compliments that had seemed generous now sounded rehearsed. Daniel hadn't just been leaving me emotionally, he had been transitioning me out of relevance. I didn't challenge the documents directly. Instead, I asked questions that sounded naive. Requests framed as clarification, never accusation. Each answer I received confirmed what I already suspected. Daniel believed the process was finished. His confidence was complete, unguarded, and careless in its certainty. That confidence was my opening. I reached out to a financial advisor Daniel had once dismissed as overly cautious. At the time, he'd laughed about their warnings, insisting that risk was part of growth. Now, sitting across from them, I understood why Daniel had never wanted them involved. They didn't speak in hypotheticals, they spoke in contingencies. We reviewed what was visible and what wasn't, what could be challenged and what couldn't. Most importantly, what could be paused. Because while Daniel had been focused on movement, on getting away cleanly and quickly, he had underestimated the power of delay. Systems built to move money efficiently are also designed to stop it when the right questions are asked. I didn't need everything back. Not yet, I just needed time. The advisor explained it plainly. There were mechanisms in place meant to protect against fraud, coercion, and misrepresentation. They weren't triggered by emotion, they were triggered by inconsistency. And Daniel's plan, while careful, had relied on consistency that no longer existed. A single review request was enough to slow things down. Not halt them, not reverse them, but introduce friction. I filed it without fanfare, attaching documentation that raised concerns without making accusations. It was the kind of request designed to be taken seriously but not urgently enough to alert the wrong people immediately. Days passed, then weeks. The first sign that something had shifted came in the form of a message from Daniel. Short, irritated, asking if I had touched anything related to the accounts. I responded calmly, truthfully, and without detail. I said I was reviewing my options, that I wanted clarity. I didn't mention advisors or filings or delays. His reply came quickly, sharper than the last. He told me I was overreacting, that everything was legal, that I was wasting time and energy fighting something that was already decided. The tone was familiar, patronizing in a way that used to make me doubt myself. This time it didn't work. Behind his frustration was something else. Uncertainty. He wouldn't have reached out if everything were as secure as he believed. That realization steadied me more than anything else had. I noticed changes after that. Transfers that had once moved smoothly now took longer. Updates that used to come automatically were suddenly pending. It wasn't enough to cause alarm, but it was enough to unsettle someone who relied on speed and distance. Daniel tried to mask it. He spoke about future plans, about investments abroad, about how relieved he was to finally be free of complications. But the cracks were there if you listened closely. He asked more questions. He checked in more often. He wanted reassurance without admitting he needed it. Meanwhile, I expanded my circle quietly. Not friends, not family, but professionals who understood leverage better than loyalty. Each conversation added another layer of protection, another barrier Daniel hadn't anticipated. He had prepared for emotional resistance, for public embarrassment, for arguments and tears. He had not prepared for patience. What surprised me most was how little it took to destabilize his certainty. He had built his plan on the assumption that I would either collapse or confront him directly. Both outcomes were familiar to him. Both could be managed. What he hadn't accounted for was my refusal to play either role. I didn't argue, I didn't threaten, I didn't plead. I let the system do what it was designed to do when someone asked the right questions at the right time. There was a moment, late one evening, when I realized the balance had shifted. I was reviewing updates when I saw a notation that hadn't been there before. A temporary restriction. Narrow, specific, and easy to overlook if you weren't watching closely. I sat back and let the weight of it settle. Daniel was no longer moving freely. Not yet trapped, not yet exposed, but no longer untouchable. The distance he had created between us, The miles he believed would keep him safe had become a liability. Every delay increased scrutiny. Every question raised the cost of maintaining the illusion that everything was under control. That night when my phone buzzed again, I didn't answer immediately. I let it ring until it stopped, then continued reading. For the first time since he'd left, I wasn't reacting to Daniel's actions. He was reacting to mine. And though he didn't know it yet, the system he trusted to protect him had begun to turn inward, slowly and methodically. This wasn't the end. It wasn't even the beginning of the end. But it was the moment Daniel lost the advantage he thought he'd secured the day he emptied our accounts and walked away believing I had no choices left. Daniel stopped calling after that. Not abruptly, not in a way that would have confirmed panic, but gradually, as if distance itself might restore control. Days went by without a word. Then a week. Silence became his strategy, and I let him believe it was working. What filled that silence, though, was movement elsewhere. Quiet inquiries reached me through professionals who were suddenly being asked the same questions from different directions. Daniel was checking his footing, retracing steps he had assumed were behind him. He wanted confirmation that nothing had changed, and the fact that he needed that confirmation told me everything. The first real sign of strain came from someone else. A message from a mutual acquaintance overseas, vague but unmistakably tense. They mentioned delays, unexpected reviews, a general sense that things weren't moving as smoothly as promised. I responded politely, neutrally, offering no insight. I didn't need to say anything. The discomfort was already spreading. Daniel's confidence had depended on momentum. As long as things moved forward, as long as each step led seamlessly into the next, he could tell himself the plan was flawless. But momentum is fragile. Once interrupted, it doesn't resume easily. Every pause invites scrutiny, every question invites another. I imagined him there, in a place that was supposed to feel like freedom, refreshing screens, waiting for confirmations that no longer arrived on schedule. The woman beside him, still aligned in purpose but increasingly aware that alignment doesn't guarantee outcome. Trust erodes quietly when expectations go unmet. It wasn't long before the tone of his messages changed. When he did reach out again, the words were softer, almost conciliatory. He asked how I was doing. He suggested we talk, really talk, as if communication itself could restore what had already shifted. He didn't mention the accounts or the delays, but they hovered behind every sentence. I agreed to a call, knowing it would reveal more than he intended. He spoke carefully, choosing words that framed him as reasonable, misunderstood. He talked about stress, about pressure, about how complicated things had become. He hinted at forces beyond his control, systems that were overreacting. It was a familiar tactic, one he'd used before when things didn't go his way. I listened without interrupting, letting him fill the space with explanations that only confirmed his vulnerability. When he finally paused, waiting for reassurance or outrage, I gave him neither. I said I was taking things one step at a time, that I wanted everything to be clear and fair, that I believed in letting processes run their course. The line went quiet for a moment after that. Not disconnected, just silent. I could almost hear him recalibrating, adjusting to a version of me that didn't respond the way he expected. After the call ended, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not satisfaction, not triumph, but certainty. Daniel was no longer ahead of me. We were moving in parallel now, and I could see his path more clearly than he could see mine. Meanwhile, pressure was building in places he couldn't reach. Reviews triggered other reviews. One delay justified another. The system doesn't need to be convinced all at once. It only needs enough reason to keep looking. And once it does, it rarely stops at the surface. I was informed, discreetly, that certain options Daniel had counted on were no longer available. Temporary measures, they were called, reversible, in theory. But temporary things have a way of becoming permanent when the conditions that justified them persist. I wondered if Daniel understood that yet. If he realized that the longer this went on, the more his escape resembled a holding pattern. That the distance he had created wasn't insulating him, but isolating him. Each passing day made it harder to explain delays, harder to reassure partners who had trusted his promises. The woman with him began to factor differently into his calculations, not as a solution but as a liability. Shared plans require shared confidence, and confidence was thinning. I could sense it in the indirect messages, in the subtle shifts of tone from people who had once sounded certain. What struck me most was how quickly the narrative changed. Daniel had left believing he was untouchable, protected by paperwork and distance. Now, without any dramatic confrontation, that belief was unraveling. Not because I had attacked him, but because I had refused to disappear. There was a moment late one evening when I received confirmation of something I'd been waiting for. A formal notice, quietly issued, that altered the balance in a way Daniel wouldn't be able to ignore. It didn't accuse him. It didn't condemn him. It simply acknowledged that the situation was unresolved. Unresolved. That word carried more weight than any accusation could have. It meant questions remained. It meant nothing was final. It meant the ending Daniel had planned was no longer guaranteed. I closed my laptop and sat in the dim light of the room, feeling the steady rhythm of my own breathing. For months, I had been reacting to a story Daniel thought he controlled. Now that story was slowing, bending under its own assumptions. He still believed he could fix this. He still believed there was a conversation that would make things right again. What he didn't understand was that control, once lost, rarely returns the way it left. As I prepared for the next phase, one truth stood out with quiet clarity. Daniel hadn't just underestimated me. He had underestimated the cost of certainty built on silence. And silence, at last, was no longer on his side. The call came at an hour designed to feel accidental, but nothing about it was. The voice on the other end introduced itself carefully, explaining that there were routine questions to clarify, nothing urgent, nothing alarming. The word routine is often used to soften what comes next. I listened without interrupting, letting the pauses stretch just long enough to signal that I was paying attention. They wanted confirmation. Not explanations, not emotions, just facts. Dates, authorizations, acknowledgments. The kind of details that don't matter until they suddenly matter more than anything else. I answered honestly, plainly, and without speculation. Every response I gave carried weight, not because of what I said, but because of what I didn't. When the call ended, I sat still for a long moment, absorbing what had just happened. This wasn't pressure meant for me. It was pressure moving through me toward someone else. Daniel's name had not been spoken, but it didn't need to be. He was the gravity pulling all of this into alignment. The ripple effects followed quickly. I began receiving notifications that weren't addressed to me directly, but were impossible to ignore. Processes that had been under review shifted into something more formal. Language became more precise. Timelines extended. There is a point at which uncertainty stops being an inconvenience and starts being a warning. That point had arrived. I heard from someone connected to Daniel abroad, someone who had been cheerful months earlier, confident in the plans unfolding around them. Now their message was cautious, asking if I knew when things might clear up. I replied that I didn't have a timeline, that these things often take longer than expected. It was true, and it was enough. Daniel finally broke his silence that evening. His message was longer than the others had been, layered with reassurance and frustration, an attempt to regain footing without admitting he was slipping. He said there had been complications, misunderstandings, delays that would resolve themselves soon. He suggested patience. He suggested trust. Trust. I didn't respond right away. I didn't need to. The power in that moment came from letting him sit with the uncertainty he had created. When I did reply, it was brief and measured. I said I wanted everything handled correctly. That clarity mattered to me now more than speed, that I was cooperating fully. The shift in his tone was immediate. Questions replaced statements. He asked what I meant, who I had spoken to, whether I had filed anything. Each question revealed how little he actually knew. He had built his plan on the assumption that I would either fight him loudly or fold quietly. He hadn't planned for transparency. Meanwhile, the woman with him began to show cracks in her own certainty. I didn't hear from her directly, but I didn't need to. Information has a way of traveling through tension. I learned that she was frustrated, that promises had been made to her based on timelines that no longer held, that the life she had expected to step into felt suspended, waiting on decisions she couldn't influence. Daniel tried to manage that pressure by compartmentalizing, but compartments fail when walls thin. He was juggling reassurances, telling each side what they needed to hear to stay calm. That kind of balancing act works only as long as the ground beneath you is stable. It wasn't. Another notice arrived, this one unmistakably formal. Still neutral, still restrained, but firm in its implications. Certain actions were now contingent on further clarification. Certain movements would remain paused. It wasn't an accusation, it was a gate that would not open without answers. I imagined Daniel reading something similar, thousands of miles away, realizing that distance had not insulated him the way he'd believed. That the systems he had relied on were designed to follow threads, not borders. That every attempt to hurry the process now only drew more attention. What struck me most was how quiet it all remained. No dramatic confrontations, no raised voices, no scenes. Just a tightening circle of procedures doing exactly what they were meant to do when inconsistencies appear. The kind of process that doesn't need malice to function, only facts. By the end of the week, Daniel's messages had shifted again. The edge was gone, replaced by something closer to desperation. He spoke about resolving things amicably, about finding a way forward that didn't hurt anyone. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I didn't point it out. I let him speak, let him reveal how much the situation was slipping beyond his control. I responded with the same calm I had maintained all along. I told him I believed in fairness, that I was committed to seeing things through properly, that I wasn't trying to hurt him, only to ensure that nothing was left unresolved. That word again. Unresolved. It followed him now, shadowing every plan he tried to make. Every reassurance he offered came with a silent question mark. The escape he had engineered so carefully was no longer moving forward. It was circling, waiting on answers that couldn't be improvised. As I closed my laptop that night, I felt the weight of the moment settle into something solid. Daniel had thought the danger was in confrontation. He had prepared for anger, for tears, for drama. What he hadn't prepared for was scrutiny. And scrutiny, once invited, doesn't leave quietly. The next phase was no longer about slowing him down. It was about deciding how much ground he would lose before he understood that the ending he'd written for himself was no longer his to control. By the time Daniel realized the situation had crossed from inconvenient into dangerous, he was already too deep to retreat cleanly. The messages he sent grew longer, more frequent, each one carrying the same underlying plea wrapped in different language. He wanted certainty. He wanted reassurance. He wanted me to say something that would make the ground stop shifting beneath him. I didn't give him that. Instead, I received something far more telling. A notice addressed jointly, its wording careful, its tone neutral, but its implications unmistakable. It referenced discrepancies. Not accusations, not conclusions, just questions that required answers. Questions that couldn't be handled with a phone call or a casual explanation. Questions that demanded documentation, timelines, and sworn clarity. Daniel tried to reach me within minutes of it being sent. When we finally spoke, the man on the line sounded nothing like the one who had left believing he was untouchable. His voice was tight, controlled in a way that suggested effort rather than confidence. He talked quickly, jumping from explanation to explanation, trying to build a narrative that could contain what was happening. He said there had been misunderstandings. He said procedures were being misapplied. He said this was temporary, that once everything was clarified, it would all be resolved. He asked if I could help. Not directly, not explicitly, but the request was there beneath the surface. Help me smooth this over. I listened until he ran out of momentum. When he finally paused, waiting for my response, I spoke carefully. I said I was cooperating fully. I said I believed transparency was important now. I said that anything unresolved needed to be addressed properly. Each sentence landed harder than the last. He tried a different approach then. He appealed to history, to shared years, to what we had built together. He reminded me of sacrifices, of promises, of how much we had endured. It was a familiar tactic, one that once would have pulled me back into doubt. This time it only confirmed how cornered he felt. I told him the truth, the part that mattered. I said I wasn't doing anything except telling the truth when asked, that I wasn't trying to punish him, that I wasn't orchestrating anything behind the scenes. I said the situation had moved beyond what either of us could control with conversation alone. The silence that followed was heavy, charged. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, slower. He asked what that meant for him, not for us, for him. I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't know, but because the answer was already unfolding without my input. What Daniel hadn't understood was that systems don't respond to intent. They respond to patterns. And his pattern, once laid out clearly, told a story he could no longer edit. Transfers timed too precisely. Authorizations clustered too conveniently. Decisions made under circumstances that invited scrutiny. The more he tried to explain, the more he revealed gaps he hadn't realized existed. Meanwhile, the woman with him began to feel the weight of those gaps as well. Her plans stalled. Her assurances evaporated. I learned that she had started asking her own questions, pressing Daniel for clarity he couldn't provide. Alignment had given way to doubt, and doubt has a way of unraveling even the strongest arrangements. Daniel's family reached out again. Their tone changed, less certain now, more probing. They asked what was happening, what I knew, whether things were as serious as they seemed. I answered politely, factually, without embellishment. I didn't need to convince them. The evidence was doing that work on its own. What struck me most was how quickly the narrative collapsed once it was exposed to light. The version of events Daniel had shared with them couldn't withstand scrutiny any more than it could withstand formal review. Each attempt to reinforce it only highlighted its weaknesses. Another notice arrived days later, this one less neutral than the last. Still restrained, still procedural but firmer. Certain explanations had been deemed insufficient. Further clarification was required. Timelines extended again, options narrowed. Daniel's messages after that were different. Gone was the confidence, the frustration, even the attempts at manipulation. What remained was fear, barely concealed beneath careful phrasing. He asked what I wanted. He asked how this could end. I understood then that he had finally grasped the reality of his situation. There was no single conversation that would resolve this. No agreement we could reach privately that would undo what was already in motion. The ending he had planned was no longer available to him. I told him the only thing I could say honestly, that I wanted everything handled correctly, that I was committed to fairness, that I wasn't going to interfere with the process, one way or the other. The process. It loomed over everything now, indifferent to pleas and intentions. It would move forward at its own pace, guided by facts Daniel could no longer shape. As I ended the call and set my phone down, I felt something close to relief, but not quite. This wasn't satisfaction, it was recognition. The recognition that Daniel had reached the point of no return, not because I had pushed him there, but because he had built his escape on assumptions that could not survive examination. He had believed distance would protect him, that silence would shield him, that paperwork would make his choices irreversible. What he was learning now was simpler and far more unforgiving. Once the truth is invited into the room, it doesn't leave until it has taken everything it came for. The waiting changed him more than any accusation ever could have. Daniel had always believed that action defined power, that movement meant control. Now, forced into stillness, he began to unravel in ways he couldn't hide, even from a distance. The first sign was impatience. He demanded updates that no one was obligated to give him. He pushed for timelines that didn't exist. Every message he sent carried an urgency that betrayed how little leverage he had left. He wasn't guiding events anymore. He was reacting to them. I learned that his attempts to accelerate the process only made things worse. Requests flagged as excessive, explanations marked as inconsistent. Each effort to force resolution tightened the net he insisted didn't exist. Systems are built to notice panic. It reads like guilt, even when it isn't. His life abroad began to contract. Plans that had once sounded expansive were quietly scaled back. Commitments postponed. Conversations shortened. People who had been eager to align with him grew cautious, unwilling to attach themselves to uncertainty. Opportunity has little patience for instability. The woman who had once represented escape now represented risk. I heard that arguments had started, sharp and repetitive, circling the same unresolved questions. She wanted guarantees he could no longer offer. He wanted loyalty she could no longer afford. What had brought them together was dissolving under pressure neither of them had anticipated. Daniel reached out again, this time without pretense. He asked if there was anything I could do to help speed things up. The request was almost polite, stripped of entitlement, as if humility might substitute for authority. I told him the truth, simply and without emphasis, that I had no control over timelines, that I was answering questions when asked, that I believed clarity mattered more now than ever. He didn't respond for a long time after that. When he did, his message was different. He spoke about returning, about needing to be present to address things properly. It was the first time he had acknowledged that distance was no longer an advantage. The idea of coming back, of stepping into the consequences he had tried so hard to outrun, hung between us like a confession. But returning wouldn't save him. It might even accelerate what was coming. The pressure wasn't only external anymore, it had seeped inward, fracturing the alliances he had relied on. His family, once so certain, began asking sharper questions. They wanted assurances that no one could give them. Their confidence had been based on finality, and finality was gone. I noticed the shift in how they spoke to me. The tone softened, uncertainty replacing authority. They asked what I planned to do, as if my intentions suddenly mattered again. I answered honestly. I said I wanted things resolved correctly, that I believed the truth would speak for itself. That answer unsettled them more than anger ever could have. Another formal update arrived, this one confirming what I already knew. The situation had escalated beyond preliminary review. Additional steps were being taken, nothing dramatic, nothing accusatory, just a clear indication that the process was deepening, not closing. Daniel's response to that update was immediate and raw. He accused the system of bias, of misunderstanding context, of punishing ambition. He spoke about how unfair it all was, how much he had worked for what he had. He framed himself as the victim of overreach, of bureaucracy run amok. I let him talk until the anger burned itself out. Then I reminded him of something he didn't want to hear. That fairness isn't determined by how hard you believe you worked, but by whether your actions withstand scrutiny. That processes exist precisely because intentions are unreliable. That what mattered now wasn't what he meant to do, but what he had done. He didn't argue after that. The reality began to settle in for him slowly, painfully. There would be no quick resolution, no private agreement that made this disappear, no conversation that restored the life he had planned. The escape route he had designed so carefully had narrowed into a corridor with walls he could no longer move. I felt no joy in that realization, only a steady resolve. This was no longer about revenge or vindication. It was about accountability, about allowing the truth to follow its course without interference. Daniel had chosen his path. All I had done was refuse to be erased from it. As the days stretched on, I found myself less consumed by his reactions and more focused on my own grounding. I rebuilt routines he had disrupted. I reclaimed spaces he had abandoned. Each small act reinforced a truth that had been easy to forget in the chaos. I wasn't waiting for his downfall. I was preparing for my independence. The final message he sent that week was brief. He said he didn't recognize his life anymore, that everything felt unstable, that he wished things had gone differently. I read it once, then closed my phone. Some wishes come too late to matter. Daniel was learning that now, inch by inch, as the consequences he had tried to outrun caught up to him, not with drama or spectacle, but with the quiet inevitability of a system doing exactly what it was designed to do. And there was still more to come. The notice arrived on a morning that felt deliberately ordinary, as if the world wanted to disguise the weight of what was unfolding. I opened it slowly, not out of fear, but out of recognition. This was the kind of correspondence that changes the shape of things without raising its voice. The language was precise, unmistakably careful. Findings had been reached. Certain explanations had been reviewed and found lacking. Further action would proceed accordingly. There was no moral judgment in the words, no condemnation, just a calm statement that the story Daniel had told no longer held. I felt the impact not as triumph but as release. For weeks, everything had existed in a state of suspension, a constant hum of uncertainty that made it hard to rest fully in any moment. Reading those pages, I understood that the suspension was ending. Not in the way Daniel had once imagined, not with a clean break and a new beginning, but with accountability settling into place. Daniel called later that day. Not immediately, not in a panic, but with a heaviness that suggested he had already read what I had. His voice sounded distant, as if he were speaking from a room he hadn't yet learned how to leave. He didn't try to explain this time. He didn't argue or accuse or plead. He asked one question. "Is this it?" I answered honestly. I said it meant things would move forward now. That clarity had been reached, that what happened next would be guided by what had already been established. He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, there was no edge left, no strategy behind his words. He said he hadn't expected it to end like this, that he had believed there would be more room to maneuver, more chances to adjust. He said he thought distance would buy him time. Distance, I realized, had only magnified the consequences. He told me about the woman with him, how their plans had unraveled under the strain, how promises made in certainty fell apart in uncertainty. She had begun to pull away, not dramatically, but decisively. She needed stability. He could no longer offer it. I listened without interruption, not because I owed him comfort, but because this was the first time he had spoken without trying to control the narrative. He wasn't performing now. He was reckoning. What surprised me was how little satisfaction I felt hearing it. The collapse of his carefully constructed future didn't thrill me. It simply confirmed what I had already accepted, that choices have weight, that consequences don't disappear just because someone believes they should. When the call ended, I sat quietly, letting the reality of the moment settle. This wasn't a victory scene. There was no applause, no dramatic resolution. Just a sense of finality taking shape, firm and undeniable. In the days that followed, the effects rippled outward. Decisions were formalized, restrictions solidified. Paths that had once seemed open closed without ceremony. Daniel's family, once so certain, retreated into silence, their confidence replaced by something like resignation. No one reached out to argue anymore. There was nothing left to debate. What remained was my own reckoning. Not with Daniel, but with the version of myself who had trusted so completely, who had signed without reading closely, who had believed that love protected against calculation. I didn't judge that woman harshly. She had acted in good faith. That mattered. But I was no longer her. I took steps to secure my own future with the same quiet determination that had guided me through the unraveling of his. Accounts were reorganized, plans redrawn, spaces reclaimed. Each action felt less like recovery and more like restoration. Daniel sent one final message before everything went silent. He said he was sorry, not in the way apologies are often offered, layered with self-justification, but plainly. He said he had underestimated me, that he hadn't believed I would see through what he had done. I read the message twice before responding. I told him I wasn't interested in being underestimated or overestimated anymore, that I wanted to live in clarity, not in someone else's assumptions. I wished him honesty in whatever came next, because without it, no amount of planning would ever be enough. He didn't reply. As the chapter of my life defined by his choices came to a close, I understood something that had taken me far too long to learn. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it looks like patience. Sometimes it looks like restraint. Sometimes it looks like refusing to disappear when someone expects you to. This wasn't the ending Daniel had planned. It wasn't the escape he had imagined. It was the consequence of believing that silence meant surrender. And as I stepped into what came next, grounded and unafraid, I knew one thing with certainty. The story was no longer about what he had taken from me. It was about what I had reclaimed. The quiet that followed felt different from the silence Daniel had used as a weapon. This was earned quiet, the kind that settles after a storm has passed and the air no longer vibrates with threat. I woke each morning without checking my phone first, without bracing myself for messages that tried to pull me backward. For the first time in months, my days belonged to me. There were practical matters to finish, of course. Loose ends always remain after something collapses under its own weight. I handled them methodically, without drama, without urgency. I had learned that urgency is often a disguise for fear, and fear was no longer driving my choices. Every document I signed now was read twice. Every decision was mine alone. Daniel did not return. Not immediately, not publicly. I heard fragments through others, filtered and incomplete. He was untangling what remained of his life abroad, negotiating exits instead of planning entrances. The woman who had once been central to his future had stepped away quietly, choosing stability over promises that no longer held. There was no scandal in it, just reality asserting itself. His family stopped reaching out entirely, not out of anger, but out of recognition. They understood now that the narrative they had relied on could not be restored. There would be no version of events that made this clean or painless. I did not take their silence personally. Silence, I had learned, means many things. This time it meant acceptance. I moved forward in small, deliberate ways. A new routine, a different arrangement of my space. Objects that had once felt heavy with memory were replaced or given away. I wasn't erasing the past. I was editing it, choosing what deserved to stay with me and what did not. There was a moment, weeks later, when I realized I hadn't thought about Daniel all day. Not with anger, not with curiosity, not even with pity. The realization surprised me more than anything else had. It wasn't that I had forgiven him. It was that he no longer occupied the center of my story. I understood then that revenge had never been the point, even if others might label it that way. What I had done wasn't about destruction. It was about refusal. Refusal to be erased. Refusal to be managed. Refusal to accept a version of events that depended on my silence to survive. The truth had done what truth always does when given time and space. It had spoken for itself. Looking back, I could see the exact moment everything changed. Not when the money disappeared. Not when the documents arrived. Not even when the system began to close around Daniel. It changed the moment I stopped asking why he had done this and started asking how I would live next. That shift had given me something no settlement ever could. Clarity. I don't tell this story because I believe everyone should fight the way I did. Every situation is different. Every risk is personal. I tell it because silence is often mistaken for weakness, and patience is often mistaken for fear. They are not the same. Sometimes the strongest move is to step back and let the truth gather its own weight. If you've been in a situation where someone assumed you wouldn't look closely, wouldn't ask questions, wouldn't endure the discomfort of clarity, I hope my story reminds you of something important. You are not powerless just because you choose not to shout. You are not defeated just because you refuse to rush. And if you've made it this far with me, thank you for staying through the quiet parts as well as the storms. Stories like this don't end with a single dramatic moment. They end with transformation, with a woman reclaiming her footing and choosing herself without apology. If this story resonated with you, if it stirred something familiar, or made you reflect on a choice you once faced, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your experiences, your perspectives, your questions all matter here. And if you want to stay with this channel for more stories about resilience, justice, and the quiet power of reclaiming your life, make sure to subscribe. There are more stories coming, and each one reminds us that no matter how carefully someone plans to erase you, your voice and your choices still have the final word. Thank you for listening. Stay strong, stay curious, and stay with us. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.